For this final topic, we're going to discuss clone selection, just some basic ideas in how clones are maintained and selected for, especially for the horticulture industry. Starting off a little bit with the biology of clones. Cloning is something that happens naturally in plants, their own vegetative asexual propagation of themselves by producing offsets or pups, bulbs, rhizomes, runners, layering, dividing, sometimes bulblets, cormlets, bulbils, lots of things, different types of different structures are produced for plants to clone themselves. In general, clones aren't favored in nature, so shrubs, trees, grasses, plants in general do not reproduce asexually as much as they do sexually, so they're not favored because a genetic variation isn't allowed. Cloning for too long of one species could leave it vulnerable to an environment change. They wouldn't have enough variation to be able to handle that and be resilient with that change within their population. Doesn't allow for evolutionary development over time. Some early vegetative propagation, as mentioned in the history of propagation lecture: potatoes, yams, sugarcane, bananas, grapes, olives, figs, and poplar and willow were propagated for fencing and weaving for different human structures too, early on. So if vegetative propagation, plants cloning themselves, doesn't help those species out, if it's not favorable, it doesn't allow for genetic variation and evolution of a species, why does it exist in nature? Why? Why is it out there? It's thought that it exists because it allows a species to be able to persist during a stressful period, perhaps drought or flood or something, and it allows that species to exist for a few more years until conditions become favorable again and flowering and sexual reproduction can occur. So it's a way for that species to last during the hard period, during the stressful environmental conditions, and till it can go back to sexual propagation, the production of flowers and seeds. So plants have a way of cloning themselves, and that is for the reason of persistence of that species during a stressful period when flowering and seed production isn't possible. Why do humans clone plants? Some of the reasons are to maintain a superior genotype. You get a plant, it looks just like you want it to, it has the right genetics of one you want to duplicate for sale, and you want to keep it that way. So maintain that genotype. Also, you can create a uniformity of crop, which is more easily managed for mass production and distribution of a species if they're uniform in size and shape and color. It's easier to propagate when you have the exact same genetic individual and you know exactly how to propagate it. It's very consistent and predictable. And you can combine more than one genotype onto a single plant. You can have manipulative abilities with that species genotype and control the phases of its own development. Here's a rather extreme example of uniformity of genetics and phenotype in a species. These they probably are loblolly pines, but they're pines for paper pulp production in southeastern United States, like North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Remember the genotype, the genetics of an individual, plant or any other organism, interacting with the environment can cause changes in that plant's genetics and the phenotype. Traits that vary in different locations, for example. So let's take the example of apples, the delicious cultivar. This was discovered in 1870 in Iowa and became a very popular apple. In the East Coast, where it's grown, it's rounded, and on the West Coast, where it's grown, is elongated, unless those on the East Coast are chemically treated with gibberellic acid, so they'll elongate. So even though the same genetics, they grow and they have different phenotypes. They grow differently and they have different shapes. It's because the environment is interacting with the genes, just as it does with animals and you. So the environment does matter. Even though you're making exact clones, they're not always going to come out exactly the same. Here's the East Coast ecotype, as they're called, on the left, and the West Coast on the right of that same apple, the delicious. Mutations can happen in the DNA, the genetics of an organism. Maybe one of the plants you're cloning, you got, say you're propagating a whole bunch of edelweiss for the holiday season, and some of them turn out in a way you don't want them to. Maybe they turn out white or green flowered, and you're wondering what happened. They're all clones of the exact same parent material, but mutations can occur from environmental exposures like to UV light, X-rays, or chemicals. And we already know that from things like skin cancers. We can get those from our exposure of our skin to too much UV light, and some of the UV light can damage the DNA in some of the cells and change those DNA so that they turn on genes of cell division, and they aberrantly, they just stay on, and they can create little clusters of tumors of cells where they shouldn't be dividing continuously like that. It can happen with the plants we're growing too. Some of the types of mutations are point mutations. That's where, if you think about a long string of DNA and all the different arrangement of the nucleic acids in certain sequences is what codes for certain proteins and tissues in a plant. If you have a point mutation, that some of the four base pairs, the bases will rearrange and change, and they won't be in the same order, and that can cause a problem. There can also be deletions and duplications and translocations, or even inversions of the same bases in the DNA strand, and that can cause a problem. Aneuploidy is the addition or loss of individual chromosomes, or polyploidy is the multiplication of entire sets of chromosomes, which also can be a problem. Here's just one example of polyploidy. A diploid tobacco plant on the left. It has two sets of chromosomes in each of the nucleuses of each of its cells. A triploid has three sets of chromosomes. A tetraploid has four. And polyploidy is just a more general term for an organism that has more than one set of chromosomes in each cell. You can see how they phenotypically look different. Their genetics are different, and the way those genes are expressed makes the whole organism look different. Here's a neat tropical plant. It can sometimes be an indoor plant. This is a variegated species with the green leaves and the yellow edges to the leaves, but this one has a mutation, probably an environmental exposure to something weird, and the leaves are now completely white. And that is not the look that is the one that sells well with this species of Plectranthus. People want the variegated one, the green with the yellow edged leaf. And I'm not sure how a leaf that was, if it turned out that plant was all white, how it could photosynthesize. It could be a problem for the health of the plant too. Just an example of different cultivars of African violets and how the clones can be altered. Even though the genetics are identical, the clones can be altered to have all these different shapes and colors of flowers for sale on the open market. Gerbera daisies is another one where lots of clones are made, and then variations of those clones through mutations create different colors and patterns that can be sold. Here's an image of a bunch of different, looks like 4 different cultivars of Gerbera daisies. You can see others in the background too. They were grown by Everbloom, which is a cut flower grower in Carpinteria. These are shipped all over the Western Hemisphere. This particular nursery is now gone to all cannabis, but for a good 20 years they grew over 275 different cultivars of Gerbera daisies. Most of them have been developed through mutations of the same genetic stock. Reversions, which are a type of genetic mutation, can also happen. Sometimes you can, some of these flowers that are cloned and mutated on purpose to create new marketable cultivars of these flowers are mass produced, and then sometimes you'll get reversions of those genetics back to their original type away from the mutation that created this really cool new thing that you were able to sell, like these white pink phlox will revert back to their wild type, which is bright pink, which for some reason, at some point wasn't sold as well. So that can happen too as a type of genetic change that's spontaneous. Also really interesting is epigenetic changes, non-genetic variation within clones. So the environment affects the phenotype expression of certain genes, kind of like the delicious apples different on East and West Coast. There's something called a phase variation too, the change in maturation of a certain species. A homoblastic type would have little obvious change in the phenotype of the seedling with age, but a heteroblastic type of variation would have different parts of the plant exhibit distinct variation of specific traits with age. So spines or thorns when juvenile and none when mature is one example, like a black locust and citrus. So that can be also something that happens through a non-genetic variation within the clone. Epigenetics is something that's been talked about lately that can also be happening with humans too, where you have changes to the genetic structure within a person's lifetime that can be heritable as well.